My name is Rebecca Zuniga. I'm the director of the Denver Justice and Peace Committee, and this is our daughter, Sol, who's 3 weeks old.
Yay!
And thank you for being here. Thank you, David, for agreeing to speak at the forum. We have these forums. We're going to have them once a month for the next 3 months. We were having them every other month, so we're exploring different ways of doing these. And David and I have been in conversations for a few months now about having him over here and sharing with our folks at DJPC. So I want to make sure that you all are also in our distribution list, so there's going to be a signing sheet going on. You can put there if you want to be contacted or not. Yeah, I'm going to let Preston Enright, one of our board members, introduce David, and welcome to DJPC.
Yes. Again, thank you all for being here. I think I'll just tell a story of how I got connected with David Barsamian. I think I first learned of David through the film Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky in the Media. And there's a scene featuring David interviewing Noam at MIT. And I had gotten an early copy of that film. They were trying to sell some copies to help in their promotional efforts to make people aware of this fascinating film. And then I had gone to school at CSU, and while I was there, I was working at a Mexican restaurant, and I was working with men from Guatemala and Honduras, and I was hearing their stories of what had happened to their countries and their villages being burned down, and U.S. involvement, the selling weapons and the training and everything. And I was wondering why I hadn't been hearing this on the media. And it was when Chomsky came to CSU and spoke about Latin America and the media that got me questioning a lot of things. So it was in this dishwashing room at the Rio Grande restaurant in Fort Collins. I think I got a big part of my political education, but another part of that has definitely been the work of David Barsamian and Noam Chomsky and so many others that I became aware of through alternative radio. So after I'd come across the movie, I was living in Boulder briefly, and I kept running into David at the Boulder Public Library, and he invited me to his home and his headquarters of alternative radio, and I learned about this amazing grassroots media effort, and not just for Boulder and the Front Range, but how it was connecting through the community radio network around the country and in Canada and Australia. It's just really encouraging and inspiring to see the reach of this project that operates with very little money but has a huge impact. And so it's been a privilege really to connect with it and to try to be so supportive of it, and also to be supportive of Rebecca's amazing work with the Denver Justice and Peace Committee. And also a lot of you, I see some familiar faces and know the good work that you all do in this community as well. So it's my honor to introduce kind of a pillar of this activist community, a grassroots media hero and someone who I like to consider a friend, David Barsamian.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Gracias por venir. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to Rebecca for organizing this event and for that very generous introduction by Preston. I'd like to acknowledge a comrade in the very first row who's taking a photograph right now, Irene Rodriguez, who herself is an audio warrior, an independent journalist who does absolutely fabulous work. So
thank you. The Nation Report. That's her outlet.
The Nation Report. Well, these kinds of meetings, I think, are significant, not necessarily because I'm here addressing you, but bringing people together. And that's so important, to connect in a culture that is very much, the trajectory of the culture is to isolate, excuse me, to isolate us, to keep us atomized and apart. And so organizations like this are very significant and very important. They help us to overcome this kind of, alienation and feeling like I'm the only one having these thoughts. When you find out that there are others in community, there is power. It's like that old labor union slogan, about an injury to one is an injury to all. But solidarity is so important, particularly at a moment like this in U.S. history. I'm not going to, tell you anything new about the 45th President of the United States, but this is an extremely dangerous moment where there's a whiff of fascism in the air, a whiff of totalitarianism, of autocracy, of oligarchy, and outright theft. Where a handful of people are enriching themselves, and a very precarious moment for the country. So now more than ever, we need organizations like the Denver Justice and Peace Committee to thrive. So whatever you can do to support it is very, very important. I'm going to hand out, I see there are a couple of people here over the age of 40, so you'll remember there used to be a class called penmanship. You don't remember it. It was the art of writing clearly. And I say that because often after I give talks and go back to Boulder, I can't read half the email addresses. So if you'd just like to sign up, then I can be in touch with you about various events. And don't worry, I'm not going to share this with the FBI because they already have all your information. So why don't we start over here? Well, yesterday was just another day in the empire. 17 people slain, and we're at a loss for words. The cliches keep cascading from the mouths of our so-called representatives, who say that our thoughts and prayers are with the families of the victims, that it's a senseless tragedy. What tragedy, by the way, ever made sense? You ever think of that? A senseless tragedy involving innocent victims. And I thought, what is the connection? Why is there so much internal violence in the United States? Does it have anything to do with our history? Does it have anything to do with our empire of bases, which stretches like an archipelago, ringing the world? There's over 800 military bases. The violence that we perpetuate overseas then I think reflects and refracts on what happens here in the country itself. There is no more violent country, although you'll hear that Mexico is extremely violent, and Guatemala and Honduras and other countries like that. But the number of people killed here in gun violence is in the tens of thousands. And of course, externally through a very aggressive imperial foreign policy, you have even greater numbers. And Latin America, historically, has been a kind of dress rehearsal for US empire. This is where they figured out how to do certain things. US leaders have been fixated with Latin America as early as the 16th century, when, with New England barely a few years old, the Puritan settlers began to learn Spanish so they can begin construction of what they called the New Jerusalem in Mexico. Not only was the region economically and politically important for the emergence of the United States as a superpower, but Latin American countries served as a training ground where US political, religious, and business leaders could rehearse their sense of self-confidence and historical purpose. It was in Latin America where the Rockefellers and the Guggenheims and the other robber barons of the 19th century began to spread US corporate culture, apprenticing themselves first in Mexico and then the Caribbean, particularly in Central America, which the great Nobel Prize-winning poet of Chile, Pablo Neruda, called La Dulce Cintura de America, the precious waste of America, those little countries that have figured so large in the imagination of U.S. empire and U.S. Political leaders. I thought I knew a little bit about the history, but even I was taken aback by learning that up until 1897, the U.S. Navy had sent warships almost 6,000 times into Latin American ports. 6,000 times in a very short span of a few decades. I mean, and of course, the U.S. had annexed fully a third of Mexico. In 1898, the U.S. took Puerto Rico, which again, citing my mentor Neruda, he calls it Puerto Pobre. And if you want any proof of the embedded racism in U.S. foreign policy, just look at Puerto Rico and the situation it's in today. Still, so many people do not have potable water. So many people don't have electricity. This is a U.S. territory. And, it's being treated as a kind of a third world country. Well, it's collateral damage. Hurricanes happen. We have to deal with it. It's absolutely shocking that there isn't more outrage around this. And again, if this were Florida or California, you would see massive relief efforts, huge, no expense being saved to provide people with, housing and running water and electricity. So that this continues. Now, how many months after that hurricane is a great stain, I think, on Washington and its imperial policy. So in 1898, the U.S. took Puerto Rico and the Philippines as colonies and Cuba as a protectorate. This was very significant, and it's around this time, by the way, no one in the media ever asks, how did the U.S. get a naval base in Guantanamo? Well, maybe the facetious answer would have been, well, those Latins, they're so gregarious and amiable, and, they like the salsa, and they saw their neighbor to the north, had so little territory, so they decided to gift this huge naval base on the eastern end of the island to the United States. And this is a kind of deal that maybe the 45th president is used to, where you hold a gun to someone's temple and say, well, let's sit down and negotiate. And the U.S. did negotiate a so-called treaty around Guantanamo, in which I believe $1 a year is the rent. Is that a little too exorbitant? You know how those Latinos are fierce business people. They drive a hard bargain. But to the credit of the Castro government, the revolutionary government, they never accepted even that paltry amount of money. And again, right now we see Cuba being re-sanctioned, re-vilified, reintegrated into that Cold War mentality and hostility. Just when there was a glimmer of hope that the situation could be normalized, sanctions could be lifted, there could be free movements of people, and I was in Cuba just a year ago, March actually, a year ago, April, and I think now it would be much more difficult for me to go because of all of the new restrictions that have been imposed. Theodore Roosevelt teamed up with J.P. Morgan of J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the richest bankers in the history of the world, to shave the province of Panama off of Colombia, to shave the Colombian province of Panama, and stick it onto Panama so that the U.S. could build this canal, which helped, of course, a U.S. empire to greatly expand into the Pacific. Over the next 30 years after the canal was deal, the U.S. troops invaded Caribbean countries at least 34 times. But more important, it was in Latin America where politicians worked out their strategies of rule, where they learned how to administer an empire. So today, we have a situation, particularly in Honduras, where there was an election in November under very suspicious circumstances, where the incumbent president, Hernandez, seems to have been re-elected, but the OAS and the EU, which monitored the elections, said it was fraudulent and they've called for new elections in Honduras. The 45th president and his administration recognized the election in mid-December, despite all of the evidence indicating that the election was stolen by Hernandez. And maybe to thank Washington, when there was a recent vote in the United Nations on the status of Jerusalem, Honduras was one of the 9 countries in the world to vote with the US and Israel to affirm that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. So you see there's a back and forth reciprocal relationship between the two states. And there's a wonderful poem, again by Neruda, which really involves Central America, that very delicate waste of the continent, about La Frutera, which was the United Fruit Company. And the name of the poem is La United Fruit Company. It's from his masterwork, Canto General. I urge you all to read it. Within it is also his great poem, Alturas de Machu Picchu, the heights of Machu Picchu, where Neruda went to Peru, up to deep in the high in the Andes, where there was this great Incan city, and he wrote this fabulous poem. So this is United Fruit Company. When the trumpet sounded, everything was prepared on earth, and Jehovah gave the world to Coca-Cola, Anaconda, Ford Motors, and other corporations. The United Fruit Company reserved for itself the most juicy piece, the central coast of my world, the delicate waste of America. It rebaptized these countries banana republics, and over the sleeping dead, over the unquiet heroes who won greatness, liberty, and banners, it established an opera buffa. It abolished free will, gave out imperial crowns, encouraged envy, attracted the dictatorship of flies. Trujillo flies, Cachos flies, Carreras flies, Martinez flies, Ubico flies, flies sticky with submissive blood and marmalade, drunken flies that buzz over the tombs of the people, circus flies, wise flies, expert at tyranny. With the bloodthirsty flies came the United Fruit Company, amassed coffee and fruit in ships, which put to sea like overloaded trays with treasures from our sunken lands. Meanwhile, the Indians fall into the sugared depths of harbors and are buried in the morning mist. A corpse rolls, a thing without a name, a discarded number, a bunch of rotten fruit thrown on the garbage heap. It's Don Pablo Neruda. And I think it's so important to retain memory, to understand what has happened in the past, so that when things erupt in the present, there's some context, there's some understanding of why things are happening. And again, the US has always cloaked its intervention, its invasions, its coups d'etats, its overthrows, its rigged elections it's always in the banner, with the banner of liberty, of freedom, of democracy. I mean, these are terms of propaganda that should alert you whenever you hear them. You should, what fast one is being pulled on us this time? And again, Latin America has been a laboratory for U.S. empire. Try things out here, then export them to Southeast Asia, to Africa, to Europe, to other parts of the world. There was a very distinguished sociologist, his name was Joseph Schumpeter, and he wrote an essay called The Sociology of Imperialisms. And he's going to be talking about Rome, but when I say Rome, you can just put in US and you'll understand the gist of what he's saying. There was no corner of the world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under actual attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were of Rome's allies. And if there were no allies, they would be invented. When it was utterly impossible to contrive such an interest, why then it was the national honor that was insulted. The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was Rome's duty to guard against their aggressive designs. And so you see how the U.S. has grown and expanded, always, of course, at the expense of the common people here. We have a recent report from Brown University which suggests that by the end of this year, the so-called war on terror will have cost taxpayers $6 trillion. $6 trillion by the end of this year. And that's probably a conservative figure. And right now, again, to evoke a Jackson Browne great song called Lives in the Balance, the lives of hundreds of thousands of people are dangling in Washington because of the refusal of the Congress and the White House to normalize the status of hundreds of thousands of DACAs who came here years ago, who have worked here, many of them incidentally in the U.S. Armed Forces, serving in the Armed Forces, and in various other jobs. They are being threatened with deportation. This is not even counting many other so-called illegals. You have to wonder, now, you don't know this about my background, but my parents were refugees. And it takes a lot to pick up and leave your country, your land, your community, your soil. My mother was from a village. She used to tell me about the sweet apricots that grew there, the mountain water which used to flow that was so pure, and what drove her and my other family members to come to the U.S. Oh, it was a slight problem, something called genocide. And so they were, welcomed here in the United States with no papers in 1921. They met in Beirut, they got married there, and came to New York. And other family members joined them. By the way, there's this very pernicious propagandistic phrase that's being used called chain migration. I think we should again be very alert to this. We should call it family reunification. That's what it's about. And who could possibly be opposed to having your grandmother or your aunt or your nephew or your grandfather come and join you? Family reunification. But chain migration not only has a very mechanical sound, it sounds like, it gives the impression of something out of control. It's a migration that is somehow pernicious and negative. So family reunification, I think, is a key phrase to use. Now, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was, in terms of domestic policy, fairly progressive. And a lot of the good things that we have in the country today, like national parks, Social Security, unemployment insurance, these were all created during the New Deal. I should say national parks, they existed before, but greatly expanded because of this use of so many workers being hired in the Civilian Conservation Corps. But he made a famous comment about a dictator then, Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua, the father of the more recent Somoza, who was overthrown by the Sandinistas. Roosevelt said of him, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB. Acknowledging that US allies are actually criminals, and in this case, bastards, but to do business, we have to embrace them. Now, you see the thread of US foreign policy. Look at it today. Look at Sisi in Egypt. Look at Hernandez in Honduras. Look at Erdogan in Turkey. Look at Modi in India. Look at Urban in Hungary. Look at Zeman, who was just elected in Czechoslovakia. Crypto-fascist totalitarian autocrats that we embrace because of realpolitik, because we're lectured by our leaders, it's a dangerous world up there, and we have to make some compromises, so we have to align ourselves with murderers and tyrants. I mean, this is what empire does. It corrupts policy. It disenables democracy. It creates intersections with the most deleterious and totalitarian regimes around the world. Now, I think what's going on, in Honduras, and to go back to, it takes a lot for someone to abandon their homes. And U.S. policy in Central America, particularly in the 1970s, but accelerating in the 1980s, created a situation which drove a lot of the people from those republics north to the United States. Now, of course, you could say, well, they had choices. Yes, of course. They could have stayed where they were and faced death, torture, kidnapping, or worse. Or they could have moved to the big cities and lived on sidewalks and tried to find some day work. Like many of the Mexican farmers who were pauperized not just by NAFTA, but by crony corporate capitalism, which created all these incentives for large US agribusinesses to dump grain, subsidized grain, into the Mexican market. Mexican farmers could not compete with them. And again, they had a choice. They could stay where they were and starve. Okay, watch your family starve, that's an option. Or you could move to Mexico City or Monterrey or Veracruz or one of the big cities and try and find work there, which is not very much. Or you can try and go north. So we have an enormous responsibility as North Americans for this crisis, which is largely an outgrowth of interventionist policies and an extremely paternalistic attitude toward Latinos. The happy-go-lucky Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball, everyone is a salsero and playing music and congas and Perez Prado and, all of these kinds of Chiquita Banana, let's not forget her. These are the kinds of, imperial attitudes that persist today that we must resist. And we can resist it by creating and supporting organizations such as your group here, Denver Justice and Peace Committee, Alternative Radio in Boulder, and I hope next time you come to Boulder, you'll come and visit me. Just give us a call before you come. I'm going to be handing out little catalogs, actually, and the phone number is on here for those of you who didn't get it. So come and visit Alternative Radio. We have KGNU is centered in Boulder and Denver. 1390 AM, 88.5 FM. Every Wednesday evening at 6, you can hear alternative radio. Last night there was a program with David K. Johnston on Trump, the age of mendacity. Next week, next week will be James Foreman Jr., an African-American scholar on crime and punishment in Black America. And you see how internal imperialism continues. It's not just external. African-Americans are incarcerated wildly in a disproportionate rate compared to the percentage of their population. Could that be racism? Are all these police shootings related to racism? Could that be? Yes, indeed. It persists. It's constant. Organizations like Black Lives Matter have been focusing on this, on police brutality, on outrageous sentencing of people of color, way out of proportion to the so-called crimes that they commit. Many of those crimes are nonviolent. They're victimless crimes. Nevertheless, because of mandatory sentencing, so many people of color are in prison. And the week after next will be the wonderful Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, great scholar. I've done a number of programs with her, and it's called An Indigenous People's History. I have a new book out with Noam Chomsky called Global Discontents, The Threats to Democracy. If I may say, this is my 11th book with him, the legendary MIT professor who practically invented the field of linguistics, and I think this is the best one, because I must tell you, the editing has been ruthless. It is so pared down, and I think there's a great virtue in terseness, in being precise. And Noam, we love Noam, but he does have a tendency to ramble and to introduce a lot of other facts and information, so I make this bad joke that sometimes his sentences start in Tampa, Florida, and they end in Santa Monica, California, and somewhere in between there was a thread, but you've already forgotten it because it's such a long sentence. So this is, I think, a book to get, and I hope you do, and I have copies here. Some of the chapters are on power systems, do not give gifts, a tour of the Middle East, the roots of conflicts. I think that's so important. Again, as Howard Zinn would always say, history is an important contested area. It's not some collection of neutral facts. It's highly ideological. What you choose to focus on, what you choose to omit. I mean, all of these are, you can find in his masterwork of People's History in the United States, which if you don't have, you have to have it, where he recovers a lot of the lost history, particularly looking at communities of color, particularly focusing on the people on the bottom, because historically, history has been the purview and has been the kind of property of very sophisticated Ivy League white men who then perpetuate a kind of attitude about history which tends to reflect very favorably on the particular class that they represent. Class, of course, is a kind of a taboo subject, although occasionally you hear about, we have to help the middle class, as we did with this recent tax, I want to say, not bill or law, but tax giveaway to the super rich who will garner most of the benefits from that particular tax law. So in some ways, the country is reverting back to its so-called founding fathers, who are called the founding finaglers, in that John Jay, the first one of the signers of the Declaration, first Supreme Court Justice, president of the first Constitutional Convention, he said those who own the country ought to govern it. And James Madison, who's considered like the dean or the great sage of the founding finaglers. He was asked about what should the role of government be. And he said, the aim of government is to protect the opulent minority from the majority. I'll have to repeat that. To protect the opulent minority from the majority. The majority that would never agree to their being fleeced, who would never agree to the outrageous economic policies which have enabled the 1% and the 1/10 of 1% to have the greatest concentration of wealth in the history, not just of the United States, but in the history of the world. And it was Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis who said, excuse me, you can have two things. You can have great concentrations of wealth, or you can have a democracy, but you cannot have both. And we see today how democracy is being eroded because of this extreme concentration of wealth into the hands of a few who are basically directing the economy, the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, all of these lobbies. I was just again thinking about yesterday and the killings in Florida, the inordinate power of a handful of people. That's all the NRA is, the National Rifle Association. It's a handful of people, but they have huge amounts of money, which they spread liberally over liberals and conservatives in order to protect what they call their sacred gun rights. It was interesting, yesterday the gun that was involved was the AR-15. This is the favored weapon, an automatic weapon, high velocity, a weapon that can kill many people in a very short period of time. This is not something you would use for deer hunting. It's clearly aimed at human life. And so how does a teenager get a hold of this weapon? Why are there so many weapons available? Why is there such resistance to any kind of sensible gun control? You know, police chiefs in this country, and I'm sure this is true in Denver as well, are probably one of the most conservative and orthodox groups of people. To a person, every single police chief wants more gun control, wants to make it more difficult for people to get their hands on, particularly on automatic weapons, which has nothing to do with self-defense or with hunting, if that's the excuse that's given. So again, the repetition, the endless cliches that flow out of the mouths of these TV and radio anchors, like ad nauseum. And I don't know about you, but I'm fed up. I'm pretty angry about it. I'm angry about what's happening in Puerto Rico. I'm angry about the racism. I'm angry about the imperialism, the Afghan war, the longest war in U.S. history, going now into its 16th, 17th year, with no end in sight, with more troops being sent, with wars in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya. Look around the world, and there you see U.S. military personnel, weapons, fleets, aircraft carriers, Air Force bases all over the place. Incidentally, there are U.S. military forces in Honduras. Central America was wrecked in the 1980s because of U.S. counterinsurgency. You remember the Sandinistas were going to come to Harlingen, Texas? And they were going to take over the United States. I guess you forgot that. You were so busy hiding in your closets because, the Sandinistas was such an overwhelming military force. Fortunately, we were able to defend ourselves against them. And this kind of thing, repeated over and over again. So I think this is a time not for neutrality, not for looking the other way, not for being a good German and pretending not to know, but being engaged. I think this moment demands of us engagement, of participation, of being involved in community actions, in getting off of Facebook and into the face of people with power, going to Cory Gardner's office, going to Michael Bennett's office, harassing them, haranguing them whenever they are in public. Don't spare any quarter. Look what the Tea Party did in 2010. With a handful of apparatchiks, they were able to capture the imagination of the media, who love to see some disruption, who love to see some, action going back and forth with people yelling. It's very exciting for them. And so, we can do that together. So this isn't a time to sit back and hedge your bets and, wonder, well, I'll see, I'll get around to it, I'm kind of busy, problems at home, I can't pay. Yeah, the whole system is designed to keep you marginalized, to keep you away from participation, away from engagement. That's the genius of the culture, to relegate people to the sidelines. Don't worry about these things. They're very complicated. Leave it to the experts. Leave it to the pundits. You just worry about yourself. Look out for number one. Well, looking out for number one has been the mantra of corporate capitalism, of course, almost since its inception. We have to think in terms of the community, and that's why, again, KGNU brings community together through the airwaves, so that you understand, you realize that you're not a single person having these weird ideas that there's something wrong with this economy. Why do we have such a disproportionate amount of the budget going to the military? Why do we have F-35s and all of these Ford-class aircraft carriers costing $13 billion a pop, or Zumwalt-class destroyers at $4.2 billion a pop, when there's no money for education, there's no money for the environment, there's no money for health care, there's no money for all these things for infrastructure, for roads. We are a disgrace when it comes to public transportation, high-speed rail. Go to China, go to Japan, go to Europe, see what they've done with high-speed rail. Now there's been just a wave of accidents with this antiquated system that we have. We can't seem to find the monies. And of course, this is all part of the right-wing agenda. You cut taxes. What does that mean in English? It means, well, first of all, the rich get to pocket more money. But on the other hand, you have less income coming in, right? The federal government has less revenue coming in. What does that mean in English? Well, I'll have to start looking at your Social Security. I'll have to start looking, again, an Orwellian term, entitlement. I just got like that every time I hear the term entitlement. This is not something you're entitled to. This is something you've earned. And it's gotten this very, again, pejorative connotation to it, like liberal has become very negative as well. These things were earned, you've paid into it, it's part of a communal program, and a very substantial program. So Medicare, Medicaid, particularly the most vulnerable are the people on Medicaid. And they are being targeted for all kinds of restrictions, work requirements. Many of the people on Medicaid are disabled, are physically handicapped. They're not going to be able to get a job. And many others suffer from illnesses, they're bedridden. So, again, this whole idea of kind of Ayn Rand, David McGill Buchanan, James McGill Buchanan, who's kind of like the father of this right-wing ideology, where there's some virtue in work, and that is it has some liberating quality. What if you don't have work, or the work you have is not paying you enough to even pay your rent? I just was listening to a Latina with 3 kids. Talking, I think it was on the BBC, talking, she earns $1,200 a month at McDonald's, okay? She pays $900 of her $1,200 for rent. So 3/4 of her budget is going to rent. And then, so the interviewer said, well, how do you make ends meet? And she said, I don't. Kids go without meals, they go without clothes. I make all kinds of budget cuts because of this, low-wage, almost slave labor economy. So we are living in Plato's cave. You know, we see the shadows, but we don't know which shadow belongs to what. And that's the result again of propaganda, of the kind of Kardashianization of the media, where people are distracted by celebrity divorces and what's happening with, you know, this scandal and that scandal and diversion. So the media have a kind of societal function of being a weapon of mass distraction, a weapon of mass diversion. When I was in Northern California recently in Humboldt County, there's a community radio station there, nicely called K-MUD, K-M-U-D. And they gave me this t-shirt called Resist Corporate Media. And that's certainly part of the reason that things are the way they are, that we have a propaganda system that blocks information from getting to people, information that they can really use and so that they'll be able to decode the propaganda. When they hear, you know, it's about making America great again. When was America great again? When it was slaughtering the indigenous population? When it was, you know, massacring people here in the country? What we know it is meant by that. It's actually, it means a white-topia. It means white male supremacy, patriarchy. Get back into the kitchen, get pregnant, make my dinner, make my lunch, make my breakfast, look after me. It's about relegating women to, again, an 18th, 19th century status. So misogyny is also part and parcel. Where you have patriarchy, inevitably misogyny is part of that. And you know, the stuff that's being revealed now is, I think, very important and liberating for a lot of women who have been intimidated, mostly by white men, into silence. And the fact that this hashtag #MeToo is getting such prominence is a liberating moment. And it's kind of ironic that the occupant of the Oval Office himself has been accused by more than a dozen women, all of whom he's called liars. And he also vowed to take them to court to sue them. He hasn't done that. And his lawyer, I guess he was just very generous, paid $130,000 to a porn star. Well, I guess, what was that about? Well, you know, you don't need a PhD from Harvard to understand what's going on. And so the question is, how much of this BS are we going to put up with? Until, you know, we're stop tweeting and get into the streets. That's got to be the mantra. It's got to be getting engaged and making people with power hear you, feel you, understand your rage and focused anger. This isn't a time for any kind of, you know, politesse and etiquette. It's a time, I think, where we have to shout out, you know, so that our voices will be heard. And it happens poco a poco. We don't know how social change happens. I mean, look at Rosa Parks. In 1955, on December 1st, she decided not to sit in the back of the bus. Well, that wasn't the first time she tried that. That was the third or fourth time, by the way. The other times it wasn't successful. But that single action on that December day ignited the Montgomery bus boycott. And coincidentally, a young preacher from Atlanta had just moved to Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr. And so he became the voice of the civil rights movement. And Rosa Parks in the propaganda system has historically been depicted as someone who was kind of insignificant. She had a hard day at the office and her feet were tired and she didn't feel like sitting in the back of the bus. Nothing could be further than the truth. She was a dynamic, committed, ideologically driven African-American woman who had studied at the Highlander Center in Tennessee, who was grounded in Gandhian and Thoreauian nonviolence and civil disobedience techniques, who was the General Secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery, yet distinguished, and I admire him very much. People like Bill Moyers perpetuated this this myth until he was called out on it, that she was, she had tired feet and decided not to sit down. No one could have predicted what happened on that day. Just as in 1846 in Seneca, New York, women got together for the first time and started to demand the right to vote. Because when America was great for well over 120 years, women did not have the right to vote. Remember those days? Native Americans, people of color did not have the right to vote. That's when America was great. That's when the world was listening to Uncle Sam. And I picked up a postcard recently, and let me just read you what it says. There's a union worker, a Tea Party person, and a CEO from a bank. Okay, they're sitting at a table, and there's a plate with a dozen cookies, right? And the CEO takes 11 of the dozen cookies and turns to the Tea Party guy and says, "Look out for this other guy. He wants your cookie." That's how we are divided. That's how we are kept apart through this kind of ideological manipulation where there's a manufacturing of consent. As if I'm being threatened by, this hysteria now about Salvadoran gangs, running amok, killing people left and right. I mean, I remember back in the late 80s, early 90s when the Soviet Union was collapsing and the US elite were in a panic because they needed a raison d'etre to continue their imperial policies. So they were talking then, you'll remember about the Cali and Medellin cartels that were going to come over and take over the United States. Everybody was going to be, mainlining heroin, and we were going to become a drug-addicted society. And then they tried Noriega, remember that? A U.S. soldier was insulted at the Panama Canal, so that triggered a U.S. invasion of Panama, ousting a former apparatchik of the empire, CIA employee, Manuel Noriega. And so it goes. And now, of course, it's mostly Muslims, but it's also people of color, Latinos, that are being targeted, that are being scapegoated for any and all ills that may be found in society, blaming the others. This is what dictators have done historically. It's not just in the United States. Always find a group to scapegoat, usually a defenseless group. They have to be vulnerable. So here you have, let's say, this large immigrant population, many of them not having command of the language, being very vulnerable, being afraid to come out and assert their rights. These are human rights. These are not rights given from the White House. These are human, the right to life. You see all those bumper stickers, I respect life. I often wonder, if they respect all kinds of life or they're just talking about an unborn fetus. It's a point I have to look at. Now, just to go back to Chomsky for a second, people always ask me, well, how did you get connected with him? And very simply, I wrote him a fan letter. I read one of his books, and he wrote back. I was shocked. Usually when you write to someone famous, their secretary or someone, they send a form letter, thank you very much for your interest, sincerely yours, and that's it. But I got a letter back, and then I sent another letter, and started this correspondence, and I was working at KJNU at the time, and I said, well, let's do an interview. And that was the first one we did in 1984. It was called Politics and Language. And that's been kind of a core interest of mine ever since, how language has been used to obfuscate, to control, to make unclear what is going on. And I think I've given you some examples here, like that Schumpeter quote about the national interest. We have to have military bases in over 100 countries because it's the national interest. I mean, you're thinking, well, is it my interest? Is it the interest of the people of Denver, of Golden, of Louisville, of Brighton, of Broomfield? Whose interest is it? It's in the interest of the power elite. It has the interest of the ruling class that is promoted. And again, this is not a term that you hear in the media. Even in the liberal outlets like MSNBC, so-called liberal outlets like MSNBC and CNN, they cannot talk about US imperialism. They can talk about Soviet imperialism, or the threat of Chinese imperialism, or historically British or French or Dutch or whatever, but they can't talk about US imperialism. The thought is literally blocked from their gray cells. In the same way, talking about capitalism and the ruling class is kind of out of bounds. Every once in a while, you have a scandal like Bernie Madoff, and they feel very righteous about denouncing him for the horrible things he did. But that's just a rotten apple. The barrel that produces the apple, time and time and time again, goes unexamined. So it's really dealing with these as kind of one-offs, and then it's done. He was a terrible person. He ripped off, grandmothers and poor people, and he should be condemned, and everybody feels very righteous about that. But again, the system itself, which incidentally, at this moment, we are committing terroricide. This is like a new word I just kind of came up with. We are attacking our mother. We are killing the earth because of our destructive environmental policies, which are exemplified and encapsulated in this economic system that's called capitalism, which is about maximizing profits no matter what. It's profits before people. And it's, the earth is merely collateral damage. And I've been noticing more and more terms like record-breaking and tipping point and unprecedented that are being used with such frequency in describing the eco-crisis that they've kind of lost their impact as really powerful terms. So that tells you a lot about what's going on in a system that is dedicated to looting and plundering the earth's resources, and nowhere has that been more demonstrated than in Latin America and in Central America, where copper and tin and silver and gold and all other kinds of resources have been extracted at great cost to the planet. So our planet is in danger, and you think that this capitalist ruling class would kind of take interest in that? Hey, you got children, you got grandchildren, don't you care about the future? They can't. It's in their DNA. It's in their bloodstream to maximize profits, and what happens down the road is somebody else's problem. So that's the system that we're dealing with. A very predatory kind of capitalism at home, and a rapacious imperial foreign policy, which has created an empire of bases and perpetual war. The Pentagon strategists are now planning not only for war with China, but ongoing wars in the future. They're circling China with a whole series of bases, and that is something that is looming. Meanwhile, our mother, our Pachamama, our Gaia, is being hammered, is being pummeled, is being beaten, while maybe we do some feel-good things like recycle paper and cardboard and glass and drive a Prius and do those kinds of things. I'm not against them. I do them. Prius, I have a Honda. But that we need collective action for that. We need to come together, not just as North Americans, but as citizens of the planet. If, let's say, Bangladesh has the best environmental policy, or Pakistan, and believe me, they don't, horrendous environmental policies, but let's say they do. Is that going to do it for the eco-crisis? Of course not. It has to be global. So what does our great leader, now I don't mean Kim Il-jung, I mean the person in the White House, what does he do with this crisis? Facing it right in the face, he pulls out of the Paris Environmental Treaty, the Accords, the Paris Accords. A disaster. that was a major collective step forward by the international community to bring some sense to a destructive economic policy which was killing the planet. So, America first, you bet. Pull out of the Paris Accords. America first, you bet. Recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. America first, pull out of this or that international agreement. Pull out of the Iran deal. Now, the Iran deal, you know about that. There was not just the U.S., but the 4 other members of the Security Council and Germany signed an agreement with Iran to limit their subterfuge production and to prevent them from developing nuclear weapons. Incidentally, the hypocrisy around nuclear weapons is so gigantic that it would be difficult for me to give justice to it, because the world's primary violators of the Non-Proliferation Treaty are the United States and its major allies, Israel, Pakistan, and India, all of which have not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So Iran is being held and scrutinized to extreme measures by states that are not even signatories to the international treaty. That's what's going on today. Now, the Iran deal really had a problem, as I tell people. It was working. It was successful. The IAEA, which is the UN agency in Vienna, which goes to inspect sites, but not Israel, Pakistan, and India, because they're not part of the treaty, have been to Iran not once, not twice, but 8 times since this treaty was signed. And they have found total compliance by the Iranians. So you see what the great leader is doing, the exalted one. I don't like to use his name. Very much like, what is it? There's a
Voldemort.
Sauron, right? Yes, Voldemort. Yeah, you don't say it, so don't say the name. He is, doing these things, hoping we don't notice, because we don't have a media that reports properly on these issues. But again, I mean, the hypocrisy here is just mind-boggling, and it brings up the term of Michael Parenti, who says, the U.S. doesn't make the world safe for democracy, it makes it safe for hypocrisy. And outside the country, like in the last year or so, I've been in Armenia, Jordan, Lebanon. People ask, what's going on in the United States? They don't quite understand it. They don't understand, for example, an electoral system where one candidate gets more votes than the other candidate, but doesn't win. That's like really weird. Maybe they're very backward people, thinking the person who gets most votes should win. I mean, we have a system now that's coming under tremendous attack, which is also very racist driven, where people who have served time in prison lose their right to vote. I mean, this is what gave Bush the 2000 election in Florida. And the Democrats never cease to amaze me. I mean, they are truly an astonishing political party, in quotes. 2 of the last 5 elections were stolen from them because of this antiquarian electoral college system that we have, which is a remnant of slavery. And they don't say a word. They haven't said a word. Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, not a word about abolishing the electoral college. Not a word about moving elections from Tuesday to the weekend, like the whole world votes on a weekend when you're not working. Common sense. We have it on a work day. Why? Because they want to suppress turnout. They don't want people to vote. They only want their people to vote. So we have now all kinds of restrictions that are being introduced in various states, voter ID, to intimidate people. This is even coming down to the census, which is very, very important, coming up, where they're asking people, they want to ask people, are you an immigrant? Are you a legal resident or citizen of the United States? This will only serve to intimidate people, not to take part in the census. Again, producing very skewed results. So democracy has been, over the decades, been eroded in this country. That erosion, I believe, is accelerating, and it can only be through, again, popular force. That's how change has always happened. It hasn't happened when some great white guy in the White House, with orange hair, wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, this is a wrong system, this is not right, I'm going to change this policy. It's never happened like that. It's always happened from the bottom when people rock the Kasbah. So that's what I urge you to do as well. So just to wrap up, I have a little bit of time for Q&A. We have some books here. I have some books here. Howard Zinn, Chomsky's book, and others, CDs. If you get whoever gets a book will get 2 alternative radio CDs tonight. One is Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz in Indigenous Peoples History, and the other is Richard Wolff, Capitalism versus Socialism. 2 great programs, so that's a bonus if you buy a book, an incentive. All right, we're going to close with some poetry. Let's not forget art and the important role that art plays in expanding consciousness and creating community. It was the revolutionary Emma Goldman who said, art can make ideas felt. So I already read the Neruda La United Fruit Company. This is Marge Piercy, very important contemporary U.S. poet. She has a wonderful collection called The Moon is Always Female, and there's a poem in there called The Little Road, which I've often read, so I'm not going to read that one. She has a new one called We Give Up Far Too Easily. Why do people get so discouraged about political action? You take vitamin pills and imagine they'll do something for you. You don't say, I'll never wash the dishes again because they'll just get dirty. We all mumble silly prayers into the air. Oh, please don't let me miss the plane. Oh, please, please, let him call me back. Inaction certainly will work fine for the overlords who own our work, control our lives, consider us collateral loss in their grand schemes. They only fear masses in action. A little at a time is the way forward, an unending dance, 2 steps forward and 1 back. Sitting on your ass too long makes you more. Marge Piercy. Now this is, any Urdu speakers out there? Not tonight. Urdu is the national language of Pakistan. It's spoken throughout North India. It's a very rich amalgam of Arabic, Turkish, Hindi, Persian, and other languages. The greatest Urdu poet of the 20th century was Faiz Ahmed Faiz. He was born in 1911, he died in 1984. He was a trade union member and proud of it, a journalist and proud of it, a communist and proud of it, and a great, great poet. And his most famous poem is called Bol, B-O-L. So in Urdu and Hindi, this is the imperative, speak. And so at demonstrations in South Asia, I may be going to Pakistan in the next month or 2. I'm currently banned from India because of my reporting. It's going on 7 years now. But if you go to demonstrations, you'll see placards with these 3 letters, B-O-L, and everybody knows what it is. Oh, Faiz's poem, this poem of resistance. Speak, your lips are free. Speak, your tongue is still yours. This magnificent body is still yours. Speak, speak, there is little time, but little though there is, it is enough time. Enough before the body perishes, before the tongue atrophies. Speak, the truth still lives. Say what you have to say. Speak, your lips are free. Bold, bold, bold. Faiz. And finally, Frederick Douglass. an escaped slave, African-American liberationist. He gave a talk in August of 1857. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom, yet deprecate agitation, are men and women who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the mighty roar of its waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. So on that note, understanding this truth that power concedes nothing without a demand, it is incumbent upon us to act, to engage, to be citizens for the fight for democracy and the fight for sustaining and preserving Pachamama, our precious earth. Thank you very much. So we have time for some questions?
Yes.
Comments? I'd like to hear, by the way, what you are doing. If you can have some interaction among yourselves. I mean, I want to hear what you're doing as well. But what things are you working on? What is attracting you? Yes? Yes?
Well, my name is Ernesto Vigil. I live within walking distance from here. Two of my friends went over to a local meeting because a candidate is going to announce his race for this district. So we had to divide forces. We had to go over there, and I came over here. In your presentation, you talk about the $6 trillion spent on the military. I would just like to suggest that when you make that point in the future, if you would add to it, who are the people who profited from that $6 trillion? Because it was spent, but someone got it. So that's just a minor comment.
No, that's an excellent point. I'll tell you who they are.
I did want to ask, though, that by having said that I'm from this district, I just turned 70 in January. I've been politically active since I was 20. So I've watched how things evolved, and I remember when Reagan got elected promising to slash the deficit, he made it bigger, but he slashed the social programs, and in 5 years spent more money on the military than had been spent since 1950, in 5 years. What happened then leads to the destruction that we see on the local level, where we see people sleeping on the streets. So those of you that live in North Denver, or if you live in one of the areas that are rapidly being gentrified, you would not be here if you didn't have a social conscience. So those of you who may live in one of those districts, if you would want to help low-income people, could you give me your contact information, and I can let you know about things that we plan to do in the future. I don't put my hopes in elections. I put my hopes in organizing the community. I do not trust politics, and you are directly 100% correct that every major change in this country has come from the grassroots up. So I want to thank you for all your comments.
You're very welcome. Well, the beneficiaries of the military-industrial complex are well known. It's no secret. It's Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, United Technologies, General Dynamics, General Electric. These are the major contractors that have benefited from constant warfare. So when some elements of the economy, a very narrow sliver of the economy, but extremely powerful, when they have an institutional investment in conflict, then there is a tendency for the state, which is basically at the service of these corporations, to promote more and more foreign interventions, coup d'etats, invasions, drone attacks, bombing attacks, etc. You see the connection there. So this is why. Why is the U.S. perpetually at war? No one even asks this question. There are reasons based in policy and based in institutions that keep promoting conflict as opposed to conflict resolution. If peace were to break out, let's imagine, let's close our eyes for a second and imagine a utopian universe where there are no homeless people, people live in dignity, they have proper housing, affordable housing, are well-clothed, well-fed, eat nutritious food, organic agriculture. Imagine that. Would that benefit these major arms manufacturers? It'd be a disaster for them. It'd be a full-scale depression. So there's a tremendous, push toward creating and sustaining conflict. That's why we're engaged in countries that most Americans can't even find on the map, like Niger. They confuse it with Nigeria if they don't know where that is. Or Mali, or Libya, or Somalia, or Yemen, which is being pulverized on a daily basis by another great country, Saudi Arabia.
Dave, can I add to that too?
Sure.
Back in 1971, when Lewis Powell wrote that memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, he was calling for a unification of these corporate forces. And so that when one entity benefits, they all benefit. When the media, the pharmaceuticals, the arms, the whole corporate structure benefits. So that's I wanted to point that out as a little asterisk on that.
Yeah, James is a comrade from Boulder, and he's talking about a memo that was written by Lewis Powell, L-E-W-I-S, I think in 1971, if I'm not mistaken. He was a lobbyist for the tobacco corporations, but he was also part of the Chamber of Commerce. I think he had some position with the Chamber of Commerce. This was a moment, if you'll recall, and you get a little bit of sense of that if you see the Post and other things that are out there now about what was happening in the country. The ruling class, again that term, was very worried about its position because there were all kinds of social change movements that had erupted in the late 60s and into the early 70s. The Black Panther movement, the Young Lords, the American Indian movement, the women's movement, the eco movement. I mean, there were all kinds of ferment, the anti-war movement, of course, civil rights, all of these things were going on. And they were worried. They were worried about what? Losing control of the country. And so Powell crafted this memorandum. It's really worth looking at. You can find it on the internet very easily, the Powell memo, where he says, we've got a real problem here and we've got to address it immediately. We've got to roll back the gains that these people, that's to say the people of the country, had achieved and reassert our dominance. And we do that, interestingly enough, first of all through the media. We create media organizations. Then we create think tanks and pundits to provide the media with the voices they need to argue conservative perspectives. And so it goes on to say, other things that must be done to re-control the society, which at that point was going out of control. And sadly, because they were heavily funded by our own Joe Coors here in Golden, but also the other foundations, the Heritage Foundation was established then, the Scaife Foundation, the Hudson Institute, Manhattan Institute, all of these big money entities, and more recently the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson and Rebecca and Robert Mercer and these gazillionaires and Steve Wynn, now disgraced, and others, they have been pouring money into creating a right-wing ideology. And so that has had a very pernicious effect on the political system. Yes, sir.
Well, to follow up on what Ernesto was asking about the 6 trillion, yeah, what about also the 6.5 trillion that is lost, they can't account for? And also, yeah, I was wondering about, with all this talk about Russia hacking the 2016 election and so on. And how can all this talk about hacked elections be going on and no one's talking about how our voting systems are not verifiable and that would be the fix for all of this going forward, would be have verifiable voting.
A good point, one I've heard quite frequently. Sometimes I respond by citing Jim Hightower, who said, you know, if the goddess intended us to have elections, she would have given us candidates. I wish we had a genuine second party in this country that would challenge the embedded ideology of the Republicans, who are incidentally a minority party, but because of gerrymandering, are able to control the Congress. I mean, it's again, people in Jordan, you know, backward countries, they just wonder what's going on here. How can, you know, these districts be drawn? Take the case of Pennsylvania, where the Democrats are in the majority in terms of registered voters. There are 19 congressional seats in Pennsylvania. So you think the majority party, they probably got like 15 or 16. The Democrats have 5 seats in Pennsylvania out of 19 because of gerrymandering. And this is, you know, again, with the collusion of the courts and the system. This is not to say that Democrats are angels. When they're in power, they try to, you know, carry out gerrymandering. But it seems it's more extreme right now with the Republicans. But again, you know, having a verifiable voting system would be definitely a step forward. Yes. No.
Oh, yes,
You have a
yes,
chance.
Diane.
Yes.
I would like to ask what you all think. This kind of goes with what James said about how corporate power combine themselves and they keep power that way. And they also keep us separate, all of our different causes. And it's not to say that all of our different causes are really important and we all work really hard to, you know, understand what we're doing and what's important. But it seems like we should really try to coordinate that power all the way from unions to you know, Fight for 15, to the Homeless Out Loud, to all of those groups, having a place to go to form a basis of fundamental power that they could not stop if we were able to get it together. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's brilliant. I'd love to see it happen, but you know what?
So how do we do that? is what I'm asking.
Can someone address her question?
Yeah.
Yes? Can someone address her question? Yes, Ernesto?
An opinion. Okay, that's all I have is an opinion. I don't have answers. There is no one single answer. But I think, I mean, this is my opinion, this is what motivates me. Get involved in the thing closest and near to you that you know well, that you know others are also affected by that. And as you draw them into that particular situation, you constantly keep talking about what's causing this. And gee, the people across town, here I am in North Denver, I'm concerned about what's happening here. But gee, the people in Park Hill, concerned with the same issues. Let me go over there and know those folks.
Right, so how do we do that? I mean, I get that.
It's a process. It's a process.
So how do we move faster to get to that point? What do we form? What do we form? Do we get like maybe, you know, I mean, this is kind of, you know, kind of in the idea, sort of like Occupy in a way. How do we form like a group of people that everyone, the power comes together. I mean, we're doing the same thing over and over and over.
Your question is, how do we take over the Democratic Party? You know, we need to have a party.
Well,
And if both
Organization.
parties are the same, there's nothing you can do about it, right? And the
Well, no,
Democrats, one of the things you talked about, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting here, but, as bad as Trump is, he's energizing the country right now. Obama had more renditions going on, he deported more people, there was just as much war going on, so we have this idea like there's two different things. And just, that Obama, I mean, when you really look at it, was there a big difference? Tell me that, between the two of them, and what they're producing.
I'm saying we move beyond political parties. I mean,
Yeah, there is a big difference.
yeah,
Yeah, the attack on the earth is accelerated.
and humanity and.
Yes, in general.
Right.
So that is a
It
major.
took him almost 8 years to finally start talking about global warming. That's not what he talked about in the beginning. First it was his medical, the health insurance and that kind of stuff. He didn't start talking
Yeah, I don't
about that
think
until
it's
almost year
useful
7.
now to go back and, I
Well,
have lots of problems with the Democrats, with Obama. But I think a major issue is, okay, this point is well taken. The question, by the way, was about, we have all of these different tendencies and actions, but they tend to be bifurcated and separated, and we don't come together as a unified force. I think the left historically, let us say, if I could use that term, or progressives, have historically been very non-embracing of other opinions and exclusive. And I've got the answers. I'm smart. I've got a radio program. I write books, so you can't come anywhere near me. So I may feel good saying that, but that's not going to win you over. So we have historically, again, progressives, we get into these little modules or nodes of action, be it on no parking meters in North Denver or something like that. And we focus on that and don't connect with other groups who may be doing work on high-speed rail or having electric cars or some kind of alternative to cars. Going to where people are is so important. I learned this years ago. We want people to be familiar with Chomsky and Edward Said and Michael Parenti and Angela Davis and these great activists and thinkers. But that's not where most people are. They have no idea who they've never heard of them. So going where people are, addressing their needs, like that woman who's paying $900 a month in rent and earning $1,200. We need to go to where she is and find solidarity, because that's what it's about. It's about mutual aid. It's about coming together. It's about breaking down I and magnifying we. We have a problem. It is a crisis in the culture. So being high-handed, smart-ass New Yorkers with all the answers, that's not going to win people over. We've got to go where people are. There are reasons working-class people voted for number 45. Neoliberalism and what it's done to the U.S. economy, hollowing it out, creating rust belts and all of that. And not just in the United States, but around the world. Neoliberalism now, which has been the dominant economic doctrine since the early 80s, since Reagan. Reagan and Thatcher kind of ushered it in. There has been concerted attack on the working class, particularly on dismantling unions. You'll remember the first thing that Reagan did was to break the air traffic controllers union, laying off 11,000 workers, not laying them off, firing 11,000 workers. Right after that, Margaret Thatcher in England broke the coal strike. And so that was the attack on unions that had started then. And where was Lane Kirkland, the head of the AFL?
Sitting on his ass, I'll tell you that.
Exactly, sitting on his ass. Worse than that. I mean, he was so energized about what was happening in the shipyards in Poland, in Gdansk.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
I mean, that was a good thing to get involved in, not belittling that. But his own workers here in this country, needed to be defended, and he completely abandoned them. He embraced Reagan. I'm with you. Anti-communism is more important than the welfare of American workers. And so the destruction of the union movement has hurt a lot. And that has to be, I think, a focus about unionization and making it, more accessible. Yes, sir.
Well, I was part of that as an officer in the labor union back in those days. You and I have actually spoke on the phone before. Bob Wages, I used to be with the oil, chemical, and the Atomic Workers Union.
Of course.
But my larger point here is, I really understand the frustration of how you go about trying to figure out how to organize, a movement. But one of the things that we have to come to grips with is this whole issue of money in politics. And not just with Citizens United and what's happened after that, but long before Citizens United, the amount of corporate money that was poured into the political coffers of both sides absolutely polluted and corrupted everything that came out of Washington. There's not a piece of legislation that was passed in the last 35 years that didn't have, even in the best of intentions, carve-outs for all of the corporate money that feeds into Washington and feeds into our political processes. And if there's one thing that all progressives, regardless of what issue drives them immediately, can organize around, it seems to me it's doing something about money in politics and getting corporate money out of politics, and to reinstate the ability of Congress to regulate political contributions by amending the Constitution to permit it, because the Supreme Court has said, political speech is free speech and money is speech. And so I would hope that progressives everywhere could try to figure out how to focus on that, because if we're inundated constantly with these corporate pitches and advertisements on television telling you how great fracking is by these unnamed people going by Coloradans for responsible energy development, it's nauseating. We don't even know who they are. Well, we know who they are if we spend the time to look. And that's the kind of thing that it seems to me that all of us could get around and do something about, because it's so right there in front of our face, and we need to deal with it.
Yeah, and the comment was about an enormous amount of corporate money that's flooding the political system, the very pernicious Supreme Court judgment in 2010, which equated corporations as people and money as free speech. That's Citizens, the so-called Citizens United decision. Very, very negative, and had a huge deleterious effect on the system, on democracy. Yes, sir.
More than a question, I want to make a quick comment.
Soy Robin de Perú.
I'm Robin from Peru.
Carlos Marx
Karl Marx
escribió que el imperialismo es la última etapa del capitalismo.
wrote that imperialism is the ultimate is the last stage of capitalism.
Y eso lo hace más peligroso el día de hoy.
And that's what makes today more dangerous than ever.
Y no importa quién esté en la Casa Blanca,
And it matters not who is in the White House,
porque existe un hilo estratégico
because there's a strategic thread
entre Bush, Obama y Trump,
between Bush, Obama, and Trump,
que no varía el carácter del imperialismo.
and the character of imperialism doesn't vary.
Y eso va mucho más profundo que el proceso electoral.
It goes much deeper than the electoral process.
Y hay que estar claro en eso.
And on this we have to be clear.
Si no tenemos esa visión,
If we lack this vision,
si no manejamos eso con claridad,
if we don't manage this with clarity,
vamos a estar derrotados.
we'll be defeated.
Yo tengo una idea de lo que es el imperialismo.
And I have an idea about what is imperialism.
Es como un monstruo,
It's like a monster,
bicéfalo,
bicéfalo.
de dos cabezas.
With a two-headed Lucifer monster.
Probablemente una cabeza es el llamado estado profundo
One of the heads is probably the deep state,
y probablemente la otra cabeza es el grupo Bilderberg,
and the other head is the Bilderbergs,
que se reúne cada año para diseñar lo que hay que hacer en el mundo.
who gather each year to design what must be done in the world.
Pero también tiene dos brazos,
But it has two arms
con dos garras,
with claws.
como modelo el neoliberalismo
On one side, neoliberalism
y el sistema financiero internacional.
and the international financial system,
Una columna vertebral,
and a central spinal column,
la OTAN y el Pentágono.
the Pentagon and NATO,
Un trasero bien grande y bien asqueroso,
a big smelly butt
que son las dictaduras
that are the dictatorships
y todo lo que ha creado de bandas paramilitares,
and the paramilitary groups
toda parte del mundo,
that have been created all across the world
que le hace el trabajo sucio.
that do the dirty work
En Afganistán,
in Afghanistan,
en Siria,
in Syria,
en Colombia,
Colombia,
en Perú,
Peru,
en Chile con Allende,
in Chile, with
en todo
Allende,
lugar.
in all the places,
Y tiene dos patas,
and 2 feet.
esta bestia.
This monster has
Son los dos partidos,
the two parties,
republicanos y demócratas, que lo hacen caminar.
which allow it to walk.
¿Cómo hay que desprendernos de esto?
How are we to rid ourselves of this?
Yo escuché al ponente
I listened to our speaker
que hay una responsabilidad del pueblo norteamericano en esto,
that there is a responsibility of the American people
porque no se ha planteado
but it has not been presented
la necesidad
the need
de romper con estos partidos.
to break with these two parties,
Que el sector democrático,
the democratic
el
sector
sector popular,
and the popular sector,
de izquierda o progresista,
left and progressive,
no quiere romper con este lastre.
still does not break with this
Y abrir una tercera opción.
to open a third party.
En un proceso largo,
A long process,
más difícil,
more difficult,
probablemente más violento,
and more likely to be violent.
porque eso no es una poesía.
It is not a poem.
Eso es asumir realmente, hacer un cambio
This is to assume really, truly to make a change
y construir una nueva moral dentro de la sociedad, una nueva cultura dentro de la sociedad norteamericana.
to create a new sense of morality and a new culture within North American society.
Un movimiento social poderoso
A powerful social movement
es lo único que puede derrotar al imperialismo.
is the only thing that can defeat imperialism.
Pero el imperialismo también se está aislando ahora.
And imperialism is right now isolating itself.
Se aísla de los países de la ruta de la seda, euroasiáticos,
It isolates itself from the Silk Road that the Asian countries are joining.
se aísla de sus viejos aliados,
It
en Europa,
isolates itself from its old allies in Europe,
abre una confrontación estratégica ahí,
opening strategic fronts there.
pero fundamentalmente se aísla del movimiento social popular.
But most of all, isolates itself from popular social movements.
Y es que en Norteamérica, ese centro de izquierda, ese centro progresista,
And in North America, where there is a progressive leftist center,
se está diluyendo.
it's dissolving,
Sí,
dividing.
no tiene fuerza
Dissolving. It lacks power,
y se está polarizando la contradicción en los Estados Unidos.
and contributing to the polarization of the United States.
Voy a terminar con América Latina.
I'll finish with Latin America.
Hay una reestructuración del capitalismo en el mundo.
There's a restructuring of capitalism in the world,
Hay un realineamiento de fuerzas también.
a realignment of forces.
Latinoamérica, Sudamérica, Centroamérica
Latin America, South America, Central America,
ha financiado la revolución industrial en Europa y en Estados Unidos.
which financed the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the US,
ha financiado el estado de bienestar de este pueblo,
financed
del imperialismo.
the welfare state of this country and of imperialism,
Y ahora el imperialismo, y hoy el imperialismo,
and now imperialism
retoma el trabajo de recolonizar América Latina.
retakes
Ya.
takes the role of reconquering Latin America.
¿Cómo podemos revertir este proceso?
How can we reverse this process?
Podemos hacer miles de foros.
How can we reverse it? That was the subject of your talk, about organizing, about resistance, about finding common ground and working together to affect social change. That's how it happens. Poco a poco se escala la escala. Step by step. It doesn't happen overnight. It's paso a paso.
Just 30 seconds, 2 comments. Since you raised the issue of Honduras, I was there for the elections, and when I tried to go through immigration, I was held and detained for 11 hours and deported at first, and then I talked them in. But during those 11 hours, I did think to myself, what would David Barsamian do from the time you were deported to India? And then the second thing I was going to say is our Senator Steve Benberg did introduce a bill for those who have served sentences for felons to be able to vote, and that bill did pass out of committee yesterday. And so it's an appropriation.
Thank you everybody for coming. Please get some books. Thanks to Rebecca.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
And I would like to remind you, we have a couple more forums coming up. One on March 27th, which will be a report back from the Chiapas delegation. So we have been doing a delegation to Chiapas the last couple of years, and we'll be doing another one this year at the end of the year, the week after Thanksgiving. We also have on April 19th a report back from the SOAW, the School of the Americas Watch Border Encounter, where we're going to be hearing from many of the young people that joined us at in Nogales, Sonora, and Arizona. Youth from Regis University and UCD Denver. So I invite you to come to those 2 presentations.